Hello, and thank you for inviting me into your homes once more.
Crab, have you heard?
What now?
They've found a missing episode of late-night horror, No Such Thing as a Vampire.
Indeed, one of our fiefdom tipped me off about that little miracle, and I'm absolutely elated. I reviewed the series not so long ago too. What a triumph.
And may there be many more.
Ace of Wands remains firmly on my bucket list, so perhaps the television gods are finally listening to us.
Well, they've certainly kept an eye on you so far. So then, what's on the programme this time round?
A glorious blast from the past as we venture back to the BBC2 Horror Double Bills of the year 1980.
And the films?
Well, let's have a peek, shall we?
Carswell has the key. He's translated the old book. The answer is there. Now, look. It's in the trees. It's coming. The demon!
Ah, great stuff.
Apologies for the slight delay, fiefdom, getting this episode together. Life has been throwing gremlins at me from every direction.
But we're all together now.
Indeed we are.
Then cue those scintillating psychedelic ladies and make way for my juicy junctions. You're watching BBC 2. In just under 3 minutes, we begin our Horror Double Bill season. At 10:30, we take you deep into the British countryside for Night of the Demon. Dana Andrews and Peggy Cummins star in this classic 1957 occult chiller. Psychologist John Holden prides himself on rational thought and a firm disbelief in anything that smacks of the supernatural. Unfortunately for him, an ancient parchment has other ideas. Then, just after the news headlines, we present our colour feature, The Ghoul, starring Peter Cushing and John Hurt. Behind the doors of a decaying country house, some deeply unpleasant family habits are waiting to be uncovered, and they're not for the squeamish. So, lights down if you dare. We begin here on 2 with Night of the Demon.
It's in the trees. It's coming.
Professor Henry Harrington is a man driven to desperation. Fleeing a curse he believes has been placed upon him by the Delphian Julian Carswell, a genial host on the surface, but something far darker lies beneath. His pleas for mercy are met with polite indifference, and not long after, something unseen hunts him through the night. His death is violent, inexplicable, and not perhaps accidental. Into the unease steps Dr. John Holden, an American psychologist, a man of reason, arriving in England to expose Carswell as a fraud. But reason begins to fracture. A parchment marked with ancient runes finds its way into his possession. It cannot be destroyed, it will not stay discarded, and with it comes a warning. With Harrington's niece, Joanna Harrington, at his side, Holden is drawn into a world where logic offers no protection, and belief is irrelevant, because whether he accepts it or not, a curse has been gifted, and something has already started moving toward him. Now, dear viewer, Night of the Demon, or Curse of the Demon, as it was rather less poetically titled in the United States, may not have had the lurid, eye-popping brilliance of The Curse of Frankenstein, released in the very same year, but its monochrome defiance makes it no less unsettling. In fact, arguably more so. Production began on Night of the Demon at Elstree Studios on the exact same day Hammer were busy with Frankenstein at Bray. Two very different visions of horror forged side by side. And yet Night of the Demon stands quite apart from the gothic idiom Hammer were creating instead. It harks back to something older. It reminded me of those elliptical chillers of Val Lewton's RKO cycle of the 1940s. Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie, and The Leopard Man. Three films directed by a man who understood that what you don't show is often far more disturbing than what you do. Jack Tourneur, a master of the void and the penumbra. At Elstree, Tourneur was handed a waggish intelligence script by one-time Hitchcock associate Charles Bennett, a man whose earlier collaborations included the 39 Steps and Sabotage. Bennett had taken M.R. James' Edwardian ghost story, Casting the Runes, and reshaped it into something distinctly British, distinctly unnerving, and perfectly suited to Tourneur's mastery of shadow and suggestion. Originally titled The Haunted, and at one stage The Bewitched, the film wears its literary ancestry proudly. It is an English story of arcane antiquary with bite, because, unnervingly for the film, almost everything in Night of the Demon takes place at night, and even when it doesn't, dear viewer, for me, it feels like it does. The daylight you see is no comfort here. It's a world where the sun has forgotten how to shine properly, allowing Tourneur to compose that wonderful shadow play like a tenebrious symphony. Tourneur, already proven a maestro of film noir, turns even the most ordinary spaces into something quietly oppressive. Take, for instance, dear viewer, the corridor at the Savoy Hotel. It stretches and stretches until it feels less like architecture and more like a passage to something unknowable, every recess harbouring something unspeakable. And then there's a character of Carswell. Whenever he appears, Tourneur bends the image itself. The familiar becomes unstable, reality slightly out of joint. His home, that supposedly safe English country estate, becomes a stage for what can only be described as superb shuddermanship. Hands appearing on banisters in an uninhabited stately home, and where a cat becomes something else entirely, something feral and aggressive. And when light does intrude, It slices, headlamps cutting through pitch-black roads, a train's phosphorescent glow tearing through the dark at the film's climax. Light in this realm is not safety either. Now, thematically, the film sits firmly in that delicious space between belief and disbelief. A territory later explored by everything from the film Night of the Eagle, also known as Burn Witch Burn, made in 1962, to more contemporary fare such as The X-Files. At its centre, Dr. John Holden, a man of science, a man of certainty, placed in a world that simply does not care what he believes. There's a marvellous moment at Stonehenge, Holden dwarfed by these wonderful ancient monoliths, visually reduced, almost erased. A neat, elegant way of reminding us he is not as important as he thinks he is. And then we come to the demon, that fire-scorched nightmare visage, a striking and undeniably iconic image, very much in keeping with M.R. James' fondness for physical horror. But, dear viewer, it was never meant to be seen. Tourneur didn't want it, Dana Andrews didn't want it, and Charles Bennett certainly didn't want it. They believed that showing the creature risked breaking the spell, that once you see the thing, you diminish it. And then Hal Chester arrived, executive producer. Chester rewrote elements of Bennett's script to bring the demon front and centre, and even arranged additional filming after Tourneur had completed his work. Now, Bennett's thoughts on this were quite shitty in his memoirs.
Hal Chester? If he walked up my driveway right now, I'd shoot him dead. I had to sit by while Chester made the biggest balls up of a good script that I have ever seen, taking a major movie down to the level of crap.
I can see both sides. The more cerebral approach, the idea that the curse is psychological, that fear itself becomes the killer, that's decent, very refined, but for me, the demon works. I loved it. Thank you, Mr. Chester, because those effects, created by Austria's special effects maestro George Blackwell, drawing inspiration from medieval woodcuts, are not only memorable, they're so striking. They give the film moments of outright, unapologetic horror, little bursts of visual ferocity that elevate the entire mise-en-scène. It doesn't ruin the film, it spices it. And interestingly, even in earlier drafts, the demon shifts from something vague, nebulous, to something more defined, loathsome, bestial, and yet still written in such a way that one could argue, quite convincingly, that what we are seeing is a manifestation of a mind breaking under pressure and fear. After all, Harrington dies by electrocution, not by claw or fang. So the question lingers, is it real? Or is it madness given form? This film toys with you constantly. The performances ground it beautifully, and The Night of the Demon is quintessentially British. Niall McGuinness as Carswell is frankly superb, charming, effete, faintly ridiculous one moment, and deeply sinister the next. A mummy's boy, and yet a factotum of ancient spellcraft of signs and sigils.
Yes, Mother?
Please, Julian, try to understand.
I'm afraid it's you who don't understand.
That children's party sequence where he plays a clown 1 minute, pulling puppies out of hats, to the screams of the delighted children, and then casually conjuring a supernatural cyclone to display his power, was an absolute highlight for me. I loved this sequence.
But how to prove my point? Ah, yes. Yes. There. It's done.
What is?
The magician doesn't like to expose his magic, black or white.
Dana Andrews, cast as Holden, brings just the right amount of discomfort, slightly out of place, which works perfectly. He doesn't belong here, and we, dear viewer, feel it. Peggy Cummins as Joanna Harrington is no shrinking violet either, treating Holden at times like an overgrown schoolboy. She's not wrong, but then we witness his evolution. Supporting turns from prestigious actors as Maurice Denham as Professor Harrington, and there's also actress Athene Saylor as Carswell's dotty mother, who some of you may recognise from the Avengers episode The Man-Eater of Surrey Green.
These cells, they're identical to the human brain cells.
Yes, but the shape. In my opinion, this is the seed of a climbing plant, a beanstalk. Now then, where are we? Yes, the average bean's about half an inch long and grows to, say, 4 or 5 feet high. Proportionately, this would grow to, well, say, 200 times higher than the Empire State Building.
Charming prospect.
And think of the tendrils.
I'd rather not.
Reaching out for miles. If it were allowed to seed, it would cover the earth in, well, a matter of weeks.
Will there be no shortage of beans?
And a young Brian Wilde of Last of the Summer Wine and Porridge fame playing the traumatised witness Hobart all add to that distinctly rich British texture. Oh, and just in case you missed it, a lovely little detail, Joanna Harrington's car number plate 666. Subtle, not particularly effective, absolutely wonderful. Despite its quality, the film initially slipped past critics with surprisingly little fanfare, touring the United States on a double bill with The Revenge of Frankenstein. Night of the Demon was cut differently for the American market, being trimmed down and retitled. But over the years, its cult reputation has grown, and so it should. What a way to open our horror double bill season, and to feature on the front of the Radio Times in 1980, which back then was quite a big deal. Night of the Demon is not just a horror film, it's a turning point, a moment where the genre begins to reclaim its intelligence, its restraint, its atmosphere for a 1950s audience. And in 1980, a quiet beacon that horror was finally being taken seriously by the BBC and by us, the British audience, who had always loved it. For me, dear viewer, this is a bona fide classic. So I'm awarding it 5 Black Grimoires out of 5, an absolute must-see. And you know what the most unsettling thing is? Night of the Demon never truly answers the question whether the horror comes from beyond or from within.
Help me.
Two couples set off on a carefree drive towards Land's End, turning the journey into a race. But when dense fog rolls in, Daphne and Billy are forced to stop for petrol and become separated in the dark. Daphne is led away by an unhinged stranger to a remote mansion owned by the reclusive Dr. Lawrence, a shamed clergyman returned from India with deeply unsettling beliefs, and a silent, watchful Indian servant. As other guests arrive, they find that this is no ordinary refuge, but a place of ritual. Lawrence harbours a grotesque secret, one bound to the goddess Kali, and to acts of cannibalism carried out in the name of devotion. And those who have gathered here are never meant to leave. For The Ghoul, the timing wasn't right really, dear viewer, as by the mid-1970s British horror was, let's be honest, gasping its last. The golden age that Hammer had ignited in the late 1950s was treading water with an ever-changing current to keep pace with more bizarre tastes and a new appetite for something far more grim, more immediate, and far more explicit. Right in the middle of that decline came The Ghoul, produced by Kevin Francis under his Tyburn Studios banner and directed by his father, Freddie Francis. Now on paper, this should have been something very special indeed. You've got a script from Anthony Hines, writing under his usual pseudonym John Elder, the same man responsible for some of Hammer's finest work. But what we actually get here, I found, is a far, pale echo of former glories. There are shades of 1932's The Old Dark House and a bit of imitable flattery in this plot of Hines' own The Reptile, and even a touch of Psycho in the structure, particularly in the early and rather abrupt dispatching of a key character. What does elevate the film considerably, I found, was its cast. At the centre is Peter Cushing as Dr. Lawrence, and as ever mesmerising to watch. There's also a quiet anguish to his performance here, a man of faith turned to desperate, almost blasphemous measures to sustain his grotesque, cannibalistic son. Off-screen, there's a rather uncomfortable anecdote tied to one of his key scenes. During a moment in the movie where Lawrence reflects on his late wife, Freddie Francis reportedly pushed Cushing to emotional breaking point. This not long after Cushing had lost his own wife, Helen. The result is undeniably powerful, but if true, it leaves a slightly sour taste in one's mouth. I feel Cushing didn't really need torment to get the best performance. He was more than capable of delivering that depth on his own, as he'd proven time and time again, poor sod. However, Cushing states otherwise, so it's a trifle confusing as to what actually happened.
I have really appeared in a film with Helen now. In this film, The Ghoul, there is required a photograph of Mrs. Lawrence, the wife of the man I play. I asked Freddie Francis, the director, if we could use some photographs of Helen, and he thought it a marvellous idea. They blew them up and sepiaed them, and had these marvellous close-ups of Helen, so at last we have made a film together.
Alongside him, you've got Veronica Carson, a Hammer horror darling, bringing that all too familiar blend of susceptibility to her role, even if the script doesn't always do her favours. John Hurt, still early in his career, is genuinely creepy as the twitchy, disturbed caretaker Tom. There's something unstable about him here, adding to that sexual deviancy, which made me a bit on tenterhooks when he is on screen in a scene with another woman.
If you don't tell me, I'll have to find out.
No!
No?
I'll hurt you.
Get out of my way. Ah!
Told you.
Yes, and I warned you.
Then there's Alexandra Bastedo from The Champions and Ian McCulloch. McCulloch had just come off Survivors on BBC1 in 1975, and of course would later find cult immortality in Italian horror with films like The Wonderful Zombie Flesh Eaters, Contamination, and of course Zombie Holocaust. Visually, the film has more going for it than it probably deserves. Shot using leftover sets from The Great Gatsby at Pinewood, there's a surprisingly flush 1920s atmosphere, soupy, misty exteriors, and of course Freddie Francis's camera roaming through it all with real elan. He was, after all, a cinematographer first and foremost. And then there's the horror itself, less discerning, more unpalatable, Cannibalism, corrosion, ritual atonements to Indian gods. It's a far cry from the velvet and cape elegance of earlier Gothic horror for sure. The creature, played by Don Henderson, glimpsed mostly in fragments, decomposing skin and infected limbs, feels closer to something you find later in Italian zombie horrors than anything Tyburn or its contemporaries ever dared put on screen. Those feet are pretty horrific, and with summer looming here in the UK, prepare for the inevitable. An onslaught of gnarled, cracked, fungus-ridden monstrosities shambling about in flip-flops, heels like shattered pottery, and toes that look like knickknacks, like something rejected from this film itself. Blech. Now, interestingly, despite critical derision at the time, the ghoul actually did reasonably well commercially. Audiences still had a craving for this sort of thing, even if critics were already writing its obituary. The story of Tyburn Films is also quite fascinating. Now, Kevin Francis had high hopes for the studio, aiming to revive traditional British horror just as the industry and the genre were collapsing. It was, in hindsight, a bit of a damned venture. Other Tyburn films, like Persecution and Legend of the Werewolf, did little to change that movement. Exorcist and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and a gamut of exploiters in Europe had changed the audience's consumption for the more visceral now. A huge frustration concerns Tyburn's catalogue, albeit Spartan, of horror films, as they've been locked away for years. Legal wrangles, rights issues, and, depending on who you believe, a reluctance to license the films at viable rates have meant that the ghoul has never received a kind of proper restoration it arguably deserves. Rumours have come and gone about a full release of the back catalogue, but nothing as of yet has ever materialised. Which leaves us, as viewers, relying on murky grey area releases, often sourced from old VHS prints. And that frankly affects the viewing experience, as you are prohibited from seeing this film as intended and as pristine. Because of this is a film that lives or dies on atmosphere to viewer, and when you're watching it through a fuzzy wash-tape transfer, a lot of that carefully constructed atmosphere, no doubt exactly as Francis intended, is strangled by the murky second-rate transfer we're stuck with. Still, taken for what it is, I found the ghoul to be a good old-fashioned romp. It's a bit uneven and derivative, but with enough splashes of gore, a sickly ambience, and genuine intrigue and plot, it's a worthwhile watch, actually. If it were ever given a proper restoration, a clean print, something that lets those visuals breathe again, I suspect it might even climb a little higher in estimation. But as it stands, I award it 3 fungal-footed nightmares out of 5. But for now, we remain in that frustrating grey zone, waiting, hoping that one day the ghoul finally shuffles his way onto high definition.
You're watching BBC2 as we continue our season of horror double bills. In a moment we begin with The Beast with 5 Fingers, starring Peter Lorre and Robert Alder. This eerie classic tells of a concert pianist whose severed hand refuses to stay dead. Possessed of a malevolent will all its own, it returns from the grave with vengeance very much in mind. Then, after the news and return call to Brass Tacks with Eric Robson, at around 10 to midnight here on 2, we open The Chamber of Horrors. 2 amateur sleuths, proprietors of the Baltimore House of Wax, find themselves on the trail of a notorious strangler whose idea of revenge is anything but restrained. That's this evening's lineup on BBC2, taking us well into the small hours. But first, a horror classic, The Beast with Five Fingers.
Ah, The Beast with Five Fingers, a delightfully sinister little oddity, and if you'd like to get a proper grip on it, my full review is waiting in the first of our BBC2 Horror Double Bills, Midnight Movie Fantastic, on this very channel. Go check it out.
Ladies and gentlemen, the motion picture you're about to see contains scenes so terrifying, the public must be given grave warning. Therefore, the management has instituted visual and audible warning at the beginning of each of the 4 supreme fright points. The fear flasher is the visual warning. The horror horn is the audible warning. Turn away when you see the fear flasher. Close your eyes when you hear the horror horn.
Wanted for murder, the deranged Jason Crevette goes on the run, leaving his horrified aunt to turn to the curators and amateur criminologists of Baltimore's famous Chamber of Horrors Wax Museum for help.
Welcome to the House of Wax. I'm Anthony Draco, your host.
With the local lawmen, the hunt begins. But Crevette is no ordinary madman. After a daring escape from a moving train that costs him his right hand, he vanishes, presumed dead. Sometime later, a new and monstrous figure emerges, a vengeful maniac with deadly custom attachments fitted to the stump of his wrist. He begins systematically hunting down everyone who crossed him, strangling and butchering his victims with cold precision. Each fresh corpse is delivered to the Chamber of Horrors, where Crevette poses them as startlingly lifelike exhibits, turning the museum into his own charnel house of death. When one terrified young woman manages to escape his blade and survives to tell the tale, she becomes the only living witness who can identify the monster. But Crevette is already preparing his next masterpiece, and this time he intends to make sure there are no survivors.
All right. Put your hands down, slowly. Very slow.
Just as you say.
Made in 1966, Chamber of Horrors is not a William Castle film, though it certainly carries the spirit of one. It began life as a pilot for a proposed ABC television series called House of Wax. The network took one look and decided it was far too grim for mid-1960s American television, so the project was quietly shelved. Hollywood trade papers at the time of its production in January 1966 referred to it as a TV pilot, and when it came out as a movie, a review in The Hollywood Reporter remarked that it was a pilot that failed to sell, so it was enlarged to a plush Technicolor 98-minute theatrical feature by producer-director Hy Averback. Now, dear viewer, Hy Averback was more of a solid, versatile workhorse director for mainly TV shows. Not usually flashy, but dependable at delivering entertaining, well-paced episodes across a wide range of genres, mainly comedy and drama. He was particularly at home with light-hearted ensemble shows, which made him a natural, if slightly surprising choice for the pilot of what became Chamber of Horrors. When Warner finally released it theatrically, they provided two wonderfully daft gimmicks, the red fear flasher and the horror horn, which solemnly warned the audience when something particularly nasty was coming. Although there is nothing visually visceral to speak of, one would imagine it was the tone that made ABC executives fear moral outrage from conservative America at the time. Speaking of William Castle, he had made something of an art form out of this sort of gimmickry. In House on Haunted Hill, he sent a glowing skeleton flying over the audience, and called him Murgo, and in The Tingler, he wired cinema seats so they would buzz and vibrate when the creature attacked in the film, called Percepto. Chamber of Horrors was clearly hoping to borrow a bit of that carnival spirit. At the centre of the piece is the suave but utterly deranged Jason Crevette, played by Patrick O'Neill, a one-handed madman who can dispatch his victims in a variety of inventive ways thanks to various attachments for his stump. The cleaver was my favourite. O'Neill channels a particularly unhinged Vincent Price vibe with a splendid period beard and clearly relishes every moment. The dapper criminologists on his trail are Anthony Draco, played by actor Cesare De Nova. Some of you would know him from the TV series The Rifleman, amongst many, many others. Dapper, but on occasion delivers his lines with all the warmth of a tax inspector. And Harold Blount, played by Wilfred Hyde-White, being the unflappable English gent one expects, perfectly at home amongst the waxworks and corpses. I do love these quintessentially British actors who could elevate almost any material with a raised eyebrow or a perfectly timed deadpan remark, and in this film there's plenty of those. We mustn't forget also the character of Senor Pepe, played by Tun Tun, as he's known here, or his real name Jose Reni Ruiz, the midget of the Kooky Trio. And there's Mary Champlain, played by Laura Devon, the lucky young woman who escapes Crevette's attentions and becomes the only living witness.
I model, I pose.
You're a tramp.
Also adding old Hollywood glamour is Vivian, played by Patrice Wymore, Errol Flynn's last wife. Standouts in support include Jeanette Nolan as a cigar-smoking socialite. She's awesome. A young Wayne Rogers as a police sergeant. You may know him from MASH. And an uncredited cameo, surprisingly, from Tony Curtis.
Mr. Julian.
Yes.
We're ready for you.
Just as soon as I finish this hand. Thank you.
What have you got?
If you'll excuse the expression, a full house.
Despite the modest budget, the film looks mighty grand thanks to some lavish standing sets. Rumour has it elements from My Fair Lady were used, maybe a possible inspiration for the Pygmalion dynamic between Crevette and Marie in the movie. Who knows? Bill Lava's rousing score gives Chamber of Horrors a properly lurid, grand guignol energy. Yes, the lack of gore is a downside. As you know, I like an odd splash of crimson, but there's a delightfully unwholesome undercurrent running through the story, which I believe probably turned a lot of people off. Necrophiliac undertones, severed body parts, and general kinkiness that makes you wonder how anyone ever thought this would sell through on 1960s television. Everyone was embracing permissiveness and dropping acid at this time. Rumour has it, one original script idea involved a cat left alone too long with a strangled victim, deciding to have that little feast of flesh. Alas, that touch of grue was dropped. All in all, I rather enjoyed Chamber of Horrors. The wit in the script is spot on, and it's a crying shame it was never developed into a series. The ending positively begs for more adventures. It's no forgotten masterpiece by any long chalk, but it's a quirky, tawdry, and deftly assembled tongue-in-cheek thriller. So, I'm going to give Chamber of Horrors 3.5 handy hooks out of 5. But of course, if there was more gore, I would have given it much more.
Oh, yes, I remember your hands, your superior hands. Yes, you washed them after you examined me as if I were dirt.
Good evening. You're watching BBC2. In a moment, the first of tonight's horror double bill, The Mad Ghoul, starring George Zucco, who in this film plays a distinctly malevolent doctor, transforming his unfortunate assistant into something not entirely alive, and certainly not at peace. Keeping him in that condition, however, requires a steady supply of fresh hearts, which soon leads to grave robbing and rather more direct methods of acquisition. Then, following the news and weather forecast at 10 to midnight, we present our colour feature from Amicus, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, with Cushing starring as the enigmatic Dr. Shrek, a fellow railway passenger who offers to read the fortunes of his travelling companions. The tarot cards, it seems, have very little good news to share, revealing a series of fates as grim as they are inescapable. But first, the dead refuse to rest. The Mad Ghoul.
Dr. Alfred Morris, a university chemist with ideas well beyond his station, rediscovers an ancient Mayan gas capable of reducing men to obedient, half-dead ghouls. His test subject is medical student Ted Allison, stripped of will and sent shambling at his master's command. Morris, meanwhile, indulges a fantasy that Ted's fiancée, the concert singer Isabel Lewis, has outgrown her young lover and is quietly drawn to him instead. She isn't. To keep Ted functioning, Morris forces him to carve what he needs from the recently deceased, and when required, the not quite dead.
All right, Ted. We're ready.
Why don't you stop? Why, that gag's got whiskers.
As the cadavers begin to pile up and inconveniently follow Isabel's touring schedule, reporter Scoop McClure starts circling, and the whole sordid business edges closer to exposure. In the case of The Mad Ghoul, made by Universal Pictures in 1943, this is another of those lesser-known entries that tends to get buried under the studio's more famous monsters. But like Man-Made Monster, and a fair few others we've looked again at on our journey together, there is definitely something about this movie, running just over an hour, that remains quite memorable, even if it's just in its morbidity. It's a grim little potboiler, built around the rather unpleasant idea of body harvesting to keep an experimental subject from decaying totally, and one of the first and only forays for Universal into the zombie genre. Not far removed from movies such as The Corpse Vanishes or even Return of Dr. X and its concept, where science is corrupted with predictably rotten results. The film was directed by James P. Hogan, a steady hand in this sort of material throughout the 1930s and early 40s, working across mystery and science fiction, especially the Bulldog Drummond films. Remember those, dear viewer? This would be his final film. Hogan completed it in May 1943, and sadly the poor bugger died just days before its release that November. At the centre of it all, though, is George Zucco as Dr. Morris, and frankly, this is his picture. Zucco had a real gift for playing the cultured menace, softly spoken, composed, but utterly without conscience. George Zucco was at heart a man of the theatre. He was born in Manchester in the UK. He cut his teeth on the stage before drifting into films in the 1930s, where he found his niche almost immediately. With those aquiline features, a precise, measured voice, and a way of suggesting intelligence and moral atrophy in the same breath, Zucco became one of the go-to men for cultured villainy. You'll have seen him in things like The Mummy's Hand, which we reviewed, Dead Men Walk, and The Black Raven, often in films that, let's be honest, didn't always have much going for them, but he did. Even when the material was cheap, Zucco never felt it. He brought a kind of dark refinement to everything. Off-screen, though, a very different man. By all accounts, he was mild, professional, devoted to his family, none of the theatrics you might expect from the roles he played, that makes what happened later all the more unfortunate. A stroke in the early 1950s effectively ended his career, and his health declined steadily after that. Memory loss set in, his strength faded, and the actor who could carry a film with little more than a look gradually faded. Now this is where things get a little bit muddled. Writer Kenneth Anger in Hollywood Babylon 2 spun a far more lurid version of events, painting Zucco's final years as some grotesque descent into madness. Asylum's delirium, a junkie, ranting about cosmic horrors of the Lovecraftian kind, the sort of thing that makes for a good story, but not much else. Because the truth is far simpler. Zucco was cared for by his wife Stella throughout his decline. When his condition worsened, he was moved to a sanatorium in California, where he died of pneumonia on May the 28th, 1960. A quiet end. And as for the claim that his family somehow followed him to his grave, complete bollocks. Stella Zucco lived on for decades, passing away in 1999. So while the films gave us the image of a man consumed by darkness, the reality was something far more human. Opposite him, David Bruce plays Ted Allison, the unfortunate student reduced to a shambling instrument of Morris's will. Evelyn Ankers appears as Isabel Lewis, Universal's dependable leading lady of the period. Ankers looks the part. The singing rather punishes the audience. My ears actually bled. Turhan Bey plays Eric Iverson, the romantic rival and Isabel's new love interest, a familiar face in Universal's 1940s output, and pals with Albert Einstein, apparently. Bey specialised in exotic leading men, nicknamed the Turkish Delight. He was, according to some, handsome, composed, and reliably cast in second-tier adventures and melodramas. He does what's required here in this film, and not much more. While Robert Armstrong, still trading on the goodwill of King Kong, turns up as the wisecracking reporters Scoop McClure, injecting a bit of pace whenever things threaten to slow. Now, for a modest B picture, there are some surprisingly grisly ideas at work in this film. Morris keeps Ted functioning by sending him out to harvest what he needs from the recently deceased, and occasionally the not quite dead. It's all handled with restraint, nothing explicit, but the implication is strong enough. There's a particularly gnarly sequence when a stooge in the coffin pretends to be dead to catch the mad ghoul murderer, only to nab them whilst sat upright in the coffin. Whilst Dr. Morris confronts him, Allison administers a swift scalpel to the base of the brain and then proceeds to strangle him. Talk about not doing things by halves. Outrageous, but macabre fun and gallowed humoured.
Get him up. Up, brother, up. Reports of your death seem to have been greatly exaggerated.
The central relationship theme, the puppet and the puppeteer, is where the film really makes its mark, and the dynamics between the scientist and his protégé echoed much later in films such as Horrors of the Black Museum and I Was a Teenaged Frankenstein, except with the mad ghoul, unlike the others, there's no homosexual subtext. Production-wise, this was typical Universal efficiency. Tight schedule, modest budget, as expected with B-movie fare, Universal's trope sets, designs replete with foggy graveyards and clandestine laboratories, the usual dressing. It's not as visually rich as their top-tier horrors, but it certainly does the trick. And while The Mad Ghoul never quite reaches the heights of the studio's best work, it has its moments, largely thanks to Zucco, who carries the whole thing with a calm, clinical menace of his. The Mad Ghoul allegedly was to return again in the Universal's House of Frankenstein, but was ultimately vetoed. A grim little oddity, but this appealed to me nevertheless. I did enjoy this film, and so I will give The Mad Ghoul 3.5 Mayan gas zombies out of 5.
Why have you done this? What do you want? Who are you? If you not gaze.
5 strangers board a train bound for Bradley, but their journey takes a darker turn when they're joined by the genteel but uncanny Dr. Shrek. Producing a tarot deck, he offers to reveal their futures, each card unveiling a nightmare yet to come. A skeptical architect restores a Scottish mansion and awakens something ancient and vengeful. A family finds their home overrun by a creeping, carnivorous vine. A jazz musician steals a forbidden voodoo rhythm with deadly consequences when it's played back. A venomous art critic is stalked by the severed hand of a man he destroyed. And in suburbia, jealousy gives way to something far more sinister as a husband begins to suspect his wife is no longer human.
The only way to kill a vampire is to drive a wooden stake through its heart. Watch her when she returns.
But as the train hurtles towards its destination, one final revelation awaits, and it's the most chilling of all. The origins of Dr. Terror's House of Horrors are a little more cobbled together than you might expect. Producer and writer Milton Subotsky had originally written a series of standalone horror tales for television way back in the late 1940s, ideas that never made it to the small screen. Rather than let them stagnate, he locked them together with a linking narrative, and in doing so helped revive the anthology format for cinema, clearly taking inspiration from 1945's seminal Dead of Night. But this wasn't going to be another creaky period piece. Subotsky deliberately anglicised and modernised the stories, moving away from the gothic trappings Hammer had been grinding out for quite some time by now, and grounding them in a more contemporary, slightly sassier tone. To sell it, Amicus needed star power, and they got it. Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, two of Hammer's biggest names, were brought in, both attracted by the brevity of the shoot and the novelty of the format. Cushing in particular relished the central role of Dr. Shrek, not least because it fulfilled a personal ambition, appearing in a film set on a train, and he's marvellous, eccentric, slightly menacing with a Teutonic puckish accent, and clearly enjoying himself. Behind the lens, director Freddie Francis crops up again, bringing a real visual polish. He gives this film a richness that far exceeds its modest budget. Clever lighting, deep focus compositions that keeps each segment visually distinctive. The cast itself is a wonderfully eclectic mix. Actors and actresses such as Ursula Howells, Michael Gough, Bernard Lee, Roy Castle, even a young Donald Sutherland in one of his earliest film roles. And while the stories themselves flirt with the absurd, a killer vine, a vengeful hand, voodoo curses, nearly all the cast play it straight, with real conviction, stopping it from collapsing into outright skylarking. Production wasn't exactly smooth, though. The financing was pretty meagre, with cast and crew sometimes paid week by week as money trickled in. And the score? That nearly didn't exist at all until avant-garde composer Elizabeth Lutyens stepped in at the 11th hour, giving the film that slightly outre, eldritch edge. Despite censorship tensions in the UK at the time, the film avoided heavy cuts, sidestepping contentious visuals, while still earning its X certificate thanks to its themes, vampires, voodoo, werewolves, and that creepily malicious severed hand. Audiences on both sides of the Atlantic embraced it. Anthology horror had already found a foothold on television with shows like The Twilight Zone, but here it was bolder, brasher, and gaudy in glorious full colour across the big screen. Now, if you want the full deck laid out before you, dear viewer, as I know some of you do, with cast interviews, deeper dives, and the whole deliciously macabre spread, then do seek out my Amicus Odyssey on this channel, episode 2, where I go into far more detail than you can possibly bear. But in short, this was Amicus arriving with confidence, style, and just a hint of mischief, a film that blends the incongruous and the slightly sinister with real plume, and by doing so, quietly gives Hammer a cheeky, two-fingered salute. This is an amazing portmanteau film, and a lurid must-see. Dr. Terror's House of Horrors earns itself 5 tarot readings out of 5, stacked, shuffled, and dealt straight from the devil's own hand.
This town isn't big enough for 2 doctors. Or 2 vampires.
Here on BBC2, in just over a minute, we present tonight's Horror Double Bill. At just gone 10:30, we enter the decidedly small world of The Devil Doll. This classic chiller follows Paul Lavand, wrongfully convicted and newly escaped from Devil's Island, with revenge very much on his mind. His opportunity arrives in the form of a remarkable and deeply unsettling scientific discovery, one that allows him to strike back in ways his enemies could scarcely imagine. Then, after the BBC News and Weather, we present, for the first time on British television, and in colour, Daughters of Satan, starring Tom Selleck and Bara Grant, where a young antique dealer in Manila acquires a centuries-old painting depicting the burning of 3 witches. One of the faces bears an uncanny resemblance to his wife, and before long, the picture begins to exert a most disturbing influence. So, perhaps let's start to drop the temperature a degree or two this evening with The Devil Doll.
The Devil Doll, small in stature, but rather large in impact. I love this film. And if you want to see me get to grips with the Toyland terrors, the full review is waiting in episode 2 of our BBC2 Horror Double Bill, Appraisal Masters of Terror. Please check this one out. In Manila, American art dealer James Robertson buys a disturbing 16th century painting of 3 witches being burned at the stake. To his shock, one of the condemned women bears an uncanny resemblance to his wife, Christina. Soon, Christina begins to experience terrifying flashbacks and strange compulsions. She seems to know things about an ancient coven that no one should. As a powerful modern-day coven of satanic witches closes in, they become convinced that Christina is a reincarnation of one of their executed sisters, and they want her back. What begins as a disturbing mystery quickly spirals into a nightmare of ritual, possession, and black magic, with Christina caught between her husband's love and the coven's deadly claim on her soul. Who or what is really awakening inside her if it's not her husband?
Prove that you are recommitted to our Lord Satan. Deny Christ. Spit on him!
Daughters of Satan is the slightly less woeful stablemate to Super Beast, which we looked at a couple of episodes back, dear viewer. Both films came from the same production outfit and were released as a double bill. While neither is going to set the world on fire, that's for sure, this one at least wanders cheerfully into exploitation territory and earns its R rating, or X certificate if you saw it in the UK at the time, although in the UK it was censored. I do wonder which version turned up on BBC2, the truncated one or not. The director behind the lens here is Hollingsworth Morse, a seasoned television man best known for shows like The Dukes of Hazzard and The Fall Guy. He brings that efficient, no-nonsense TV sensibility to the material, which explains why the film sometimes feels a bit flat and meandering, although it does have a rather dreamy, hazy ambience, which, to be honest, I'd rather enjoyed. I love horror films with an occult slant, so went into this with an open mind, purposely forgetting the dross that it was paired with. For the lead protagonist, we have a very young Tom Selleck, complete with his trademark brush moustache, the real star of the film if you ask me. Appearing in one of his earliest roles as American art dealer James Robertson, pre-Magnum PI. Of note also is the doe-eyed wife Christina, played by actress Bara Grant, who some British viewers may remember from the early 1970s BBC series Take 3 Girls, the bulk of which is missing from the archives. Take 3 Girls was a kind of emasculated British Sex and the City with less narcissism. However, dear viewer, out of all the bell, book and candle machinations, the real scene stealer for me was actress Tanny Guthrie, with cheekbones so sharp she could stir your tea. Now, Guthrie plays the head dominatrix witch, decked out in a ridiculous crab and lobster-themed leotard. Whether the shellfish crutch is a visual representation for us about her venereal health, or an odour spot for the blind, is anyone's guess, dear viewer. And of course we mustn't overlook her varicose mauve pantyhose. Guthrie throws herself into the part with absolute scenery-devouring relish, whether enthusiastically flagellating topless cult members over beds of spikes, or giving it her all in an unintentionally unhinged seduction scene with Selleck right after a funeral. Those moments for me were easily the most entertaining bits in the whole film. Other noteworthy mentions are Vic Diaz cropping up again. I don't think I've seen a Filipino movie of this sort without him in it. And Paralumen, the Greta Garbo of the Philippines, also takes a bow. The premise and use of the painting, the MacGuffin of the piece, with characters disappearing when they enter the real world from it and back again, was rather enchanting. And another bonus, how could I not mention it? The demonic Rottweiler named Nicodemus, bless him. But pacing here, though, I found to be often quite lackluster, with far too much waffle and not enough actual devilment. But overall, there are enough mildly amusing satanic sequences and moments of campy sleaze to make it worth a watch. as well as for those gloriously grotesque 1970s Bry nylon fabrics on parade that look like they go up like a bonfire. So it's not all bad, and it's smashing to see a few tits on display. All in all, Daughters of Satan is a serviceable early 1970s witchcraft exploitation flick. A bizarre entry in the BBC2 Horror Double Bill, but not as execrable as Super Beast. So on the whole, I'd give Daughters of Satan a fairly generous 2.5 satanic lobsters out of 5. I would imagine it would have been a fairly decent view to pass out to after your boozy night at the Dog and Duck in 1980.
You're watching BBC2, where we continue with our horror double bill. In a moment, a Hammer classic, The Curse of the Werewolf. Set in 18th century Spain, this lavish period piece stars Oliver Reed as Leon, a man doomed by the very circumstances of his birth to an altogether unholy fate of the distinctly howling kind. Then, after the news and after our short programme Return Call to Brass Tacks with Eric Robson, our second feature, just before midnight, From Beyond the Grave. In a quiet East End antique shop, Temptations Limited, there's something to suit every taste, though customers soon discover they may be getting rather more than they bargained for. Peter Cushing stars as the proprietor, a gentleman who ensures that every transaction comes with its own, rather unpleasant consequences. But first, from Hammer, The Curse of the Werewolf.
At the court of a corrupt and lecherous Marquez, a mute servant girl named Vera is thrown into a dungeon after rejecting his advances. There, the poor girl is brutally raped by a feral beggar, an act that sets a curse in motion. Vera escapes, killing the Marquez in the process, and is taken in by the kind Don Alfredo, who raises her child as his own. But the boy, Leon, is born on Christmas Day, an ill omen in the eyes of the villagers. As he grows, Leon is plagued by violent dreams, and when livestock are found savaged, suspicion begins to stir. The local priest warns that the boy carries a darkness within him, one that awakens with the full moon, driven by bloodlust. Only love, it's said, can hold the curse at bay. But as Leon comes of age and ventures into the world, tempted by drink, desire, and decadence, the beast inside him, long suppressed, begins to surface with a vengeance. When the moon rises, so does the wolf.
Here. What's the idea? That's what you came for. You came to the wrong place. I've a good mind.
Hammer's The Curse of the Werewolf is an oddity in their canon. Their one and only full-blooded werewolf film, and it comes with a surprisingly nasty pedigree. For a fuller moonlit dissection of this one, seek out my Hammer Odyssey episode covering 1960 to 65 on this channel, where I really get my teeth into it. The screenplay by Anthony Hines, under his John Elder pseudonym, draws from Guy Endor's The Werewolf of Paris, but shifts the action to Spain, largely because Hammer already had the sets standing at Bray for a completely different abandoned project, The Rape of Sabina. Curse of the Werewolf really rattled the British border film censors. The film's central premise, a child conceived through rape and born on Christmas Day as an affront to heaven, was enough to rile both the British censors and the Catholic League of Decency. Hammer originally went even further, with the idea that Vera would be violated by a werewolf, but the implications of sex, horror and bestiality combined were simply too much for the time. So it was toned down to the feral beggar we see on screen. Still grim and grimy though, viewer, isn't he? Just without the fangs. A scene where the character of Leon actually mauls a whore to death on a bed was rumoured to have been shot for the overseas market. However, this I believe is an urban myth. Even so, the film pushes its luck. There's a streak of cruelty running through it that you don't always get in Hammer's other gothic output. It looks like a fairy tale, but there's something genuinely odious once the lacquer's scraped hard enough. In the director's chair is Terence Fisher, one of Hammer's most reliable hands, keeping it grounded and stylish, so it never tips over into camp. And then of course there's Oliver Reed. Just 22 at the time, Reed landed the role of Leon and lied about his age to get it. Paid £90 a week, which he thought was a fortune. He threw himself into the part with real gusto. You can already see the screen presence and the unpredictability, the beginnings of the actor he'd become. It's not a showy performance from him, but it's a committed one, dear viewer, and it does carry the film. Production itself was a bit of a patchwork. Tight budgets, reused sets, and the usual Hammer frugality, but the result is something that feels far more expensive than it is, and despite the fuss from the censors, very little was actually cut, aside from minor trims. Critically, it got a mixed reception. Some critics didn't quite know what to make of it, and to be fair, it's not perfect. The pacing for me drags in places, saving most of its bite for the final act. But when it finally kicks into gear, it delivers enough to make it worthwhile. It's a darker Hammer film than people often give it credit for. Not quite a classic, but far from a clunker. Overall, I'll give Curse of the Werewolf 3 silver bullets under a Spanish moon out of 5.
It's a beautiful evening. The moon is just rising. A full moon. It will soon be as bright as day.
In a ramshackle shop called Temptations Limited, presided over by a deceptively placid proprietor, the items for sale come with consequences, and every customer gets exactly what they deserve. A pompous collector buys a mirror harbouring something malevolent, opening a doorway to a presence that feeds on fresh blood. A lonely office worker accepts the kindness of a stranger, only to discover the cost is far more horrific than he ever imagined. A smug businessman ignores warnings about a cursed snuff box, and soon an unseen force latches onto him, one that may only be driven out by exorcism. And finally, an antique door opens into a realm haunted by a malignant revenant, one that refuses to stay on the other side. In this shop, Nothing comes cheap, and the price is paid in flesh and soul.
Come. Two souls are better than one.
From Beyond the Grave is another belter from Amicus Studios, and despite financial headaches and the usual behind-the-scenes squabbles, producer Max Rosenberg managed to pull off a small miracle, securing American backing from Warner Brothers and Columbia. Ironically, when the film was finished, they didn't want to touch it. Bizarre. With fresh funds, Amicus ditched Twickenham and returned to Shepperton Studios, gearing up for what would become their final portmanteau film, their swan song in the anthology format. This time they turned to the work of Ronald Chetwynd Hayes, a prolific writer dubbed the Prince of Chill, known for blending the macabre with a wry sense of humour. His stories drawn from his collection were perfect, though Hayes himself wasn't entirely thrilled with the process, grumbling that too many hands were tinkering with his work when he could have done the screenplay adaptation in a whole morning. Taking the director's chair for the first time was Kevin Connor, stepping up from the editing room, and frankly he really does this anthology justice to viewer. Connor's confidence behind the lens is apparent here, as well as some spot-on visuals, especially in the finale, and he never gives up letting the pace sag. Then there's a cast. From Beyond the Grave is stacked with talent for a film of this budget. The struggling UK industry in the early 1970s meant top-tier actors were readily available, and Amicus took full advantage. At the centre, of course, is Peter Cushing as the quietly watchful proprietor of Temptations Limited, because let's be honest, an Amicus anthology without Cushing just doesn't feel right. Look at Vault of Horror. You've got David Warner descending into full psychological collapse in the opening tale, a performance that doesn't hold back, culminating in a genuinely savage killing that pushes the X certificate further than you might expect. Then there's Angela Pleasance, utterly unnerving in the second story alongside her father Donald, a pairing that gives the film one of its most memorable, quietly menacing segments. And of course Neri Dawn Porter, Ian Ogilvy and Leslie Ann Down cropping up as well. What makes From Beyond the Grave for me work so well is the balance of grisly, ghoulish storytelling, holding back from tipping into outright parody, though the exorcism story almost lets a side down. There's even a touch of that Pinteresque comedy of menace running through the Pleasant story, and I loved it. Visually, it's strong too, echoes of Dead of Night and the mirror motif early on, and then that final story, that wonderfully eerie, cerulean-tinged dimension with Jack Watson's lumbering necromancer lurking behind it all. Properly unsettling stuff. Brilliant. The moral thread runs throughout. Those who cheat, steal, or cut corners get exactly what's coming to them. No ambiguity, no mercy, and rightly so. Now, I've covered this film in much greater detail in my Amicus Odyssey series here on this channel, where I take a proper deep dive into the studio's output, so do seek that out if you want the full picture. But as it stands, this is Amicus firing on all cylinders. Alongside Tales from the Crypt, it's the studio at its most assured, most entertaining, and most complete. So I'm going to award From Beyond the Grave, as previously, 5 pleasurable portmanteaus out of 5. Despite the one clunker, the 3 other tales lifted my score right back up to the maximum. Enjoy.
Good evening. You're watching BBC2. In a moment, the first of tonight's horror double bill, Paranoiac. Starring Oliver Reed and Jeanette Scott, this tightly wound psychological thriller weaves a tangled web of disguise, deceit, and murder, building towards one final and rather unsettling revelation. Then, after Return Call to Brass Tacks with Eric Robson, at midnight, our colour presentation, Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter. In the quiet village of Durwood, a most peculiar affliction is taking hold. Young women are aging with alarming speed. Riding to the rescue are the enigmatic Captain Kronos and his hunchbacked companion, Professor Grost, soon finding themselves locked in a deadly struggle against a very unusual form of vampirism. But first, on BBC2, Paranoiac.
"11 years after the Ashby family tragedy, Simon and his fragile sister Eleanor gather with their Aunt Harriet for a memorial service. With a family fortune due to be inherited in just 3 weeks, tensions are already running high.
You're just being rude to my brother. I don't like your stupid face or your pop eyes. I'm gonna do something about it right now.
Then Eleanor begins to see someone she shouldn't. Her brother Anthony, dead for 8 years. Is it grief finally tipping her over the edge, or is Simon deliberately unravelling her sanity to claim the inheritance, all for himself? Or worse still, has Anthony really come back from the dead? Paranoiac was released in 1963 and directed by reliable Freddie Francis. In fact, his first outing behind the camera for Hammer. The film forms part of that curious run of psychological thrillers, often dubbed the studio's mini Hitchcocks. Though, truth be told, writer Jimmy Sangster was drawing just as much from Les Diaboliques as anything by Alfred Hitchcock, and the influence again of Psycho can clearly be felt. The story itself is very loosely based on Brat Farah by Josephine Tay, though by the time Sangster had finished with it, it had been twisted into something far more spiteful. In fact, the changes were so extreme, Hammer briefly wondered whether they even needed to renew the rights at all. At the centre of it all is Oliver Reed. As Simon Ashby, Reed is a walking menace, pissed, sadistic, and revelling in every second of it. There's a dangerous charisma there, something very unpredictable, and Reed is the perfect casting, although one wonders he didn't have to look too far for inspiration. Opposite Reed, actress Jeanette Scott plays Eleanor, the fragile sister, teetering on the brink, while Sheila Burrell gives us Aunt Harriet, rigid, watchful, and not quite as composed as she'd like to appear. Alexandra Davion rounds things out as Tony, the brother who should be dead. Visually, the film is a real treat. Shot in stark black and white scope by Arthur Grant, it feels deliberately at odds with Hammer's usual colour-drenched productions. But for me, that restraint works in its favour. The Ashby estate becomes a character in itself, frigid and ethereally imperious. Francis makes excellent use of deep focus and carefully arranged compositions, often letting the background tell its own story while the foreground distracts you. There's a wonderful opening crane shot that introduces the family one by one. Even the dead get their moment. And then you've got the location work, shot around the cliffs of the Isle of Purbeck. Those sheer drops and open sea, giving the film a sense of instability, as though everything could tip over at any moment. We have a score by composer again, Elizabeth Lutchins, a go-to for Amicus Productions as well, adding another uneasy stratum, perfectly in tune with the film's seething paranoia. At a brisk 80 minutes, Paranoiac never outstayed its welcome for me. If anything, dear viewer, it moved for me quickly enough that you don't have time to pick at the seams. This doesn't seem to be solely about shocks or spectacle in this film. It's primarily about dysfunctional, about character. However, the killer in this film is genuinely scary. That mask is bloody horrible, and to wear a cassock is pure perversion of the holy. A lovely touch, and the murder weapon, a bale hook, is another stroke of genius. While these type of Hammer thrillers never quite reach the iconic status of their gothic output, Paranoiac stands as one of the more interesting entries, lean, mean, and driven by a performance that's impossible to brush aside. I was pleased with Paranoiac, a moody little potboiler, and as stated, Oliver Reed is superb. So based on that, I will award Paranoiac 3.5 organ grinds out of 5. Into the village of Durwood rides the dashing Captain Kronos, accompanied by his hunchbacked assistant, Professor Hieronymus Grost, and his feisty bit of squeeze, Carla, freshly liberated from the stocks. They soon discover young women are turning up dead, their bodies aged decades overnight. Kronos has his suspicions. This is no ordinary killer, but a vampiric bloodsucker draining life energy itself. To flush it out, he sets a simple test. In the presence of such a creature, even a dead toad will twitch back to life. The trap is set. Kronos joins forces with Dr. Marcus, who has been attending a troubled household at the Durwood estate, but the doctor himself falls under the creature's influence. With the threat spreading, Kronos presses on. Using Carla as bait, he makes for the estate, convinced it holds the answer, only to uncover a dark family secret and come face to face with the vampire. In the case of Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter, Hammer gave us something a little different. Shot over 7.5 weeks, with just 2.5 on location and the rest confined to the studio, the film sticks closely to director Brian Clemens' carefully storyboarded vision. Though by his own admission, vampires weren't exactly his forte, so he did the sensible thing and swatted up on Hammer's back catalogue of fangdom. And what he found was repetition. Same build-up, same rules, same stake through the heart. So Clemens flipped it. Here the vampire doesn't just bite, it drains youth, plays by different rules, and if you're not sure what you're dealing with, throw a dead toad in its path and see what happens. It's such a refreshing take, I found, dear viewer. Originally, Kronos himself was meant to go further in future productions as a time-travelling vampire hunter, turning up anywhere, any era, dealing with different strains of the undead. A cracking idea, but one that never quite made it past this outing. Actor Horst Janssen takes the lead and fits the role like a glove, an accomplished horseman and swordsman, which certainly helps when you're slicing your way through the legion of the undead. Then there's Caroline Munro as Carla, the sexy, feisty bumpkin, or at least that was the intention. Clemens hadn't even planned to cast her initially, but once he had heard her softer, more natural delivery, he wisely leaned into it, and she came highly recommended after her previous outing in the underrated Dracula AD 1972. On the supporting side, you've got the wonderful John Carson, cult icon beauty Wanda Ventham, and character actor John Cater, all doing solid work, while Ian Hendry turns up as Caro, reportedly a complete piss artist during production, allegedly starting the day at 7:30 with a lager in hand. You can tell Hendry is having a ball and another Avengers connection. Visually, there are some lovely touches in this film. I always find the vampire drifting past flowers, leaving them dead in its wake, poetically effective and ideally Hammer. Wonderful scene. There's also the unmistakable Avengers connection running through it, Clemens directing and producing with Albert Fennell and Laurie Johnson on scoring duties. You can almost imagine Kronos and company stepping in alongside Steed for a spot of vampire hunting. Then, as mentioned, there's Ian Hendry as well. Unfortunately, the film's release was a bloody mess. No proper marketing, patchy distribution. Caroline Munro herself only discovered it was playing by spotting it in a newspaper. Which is a great shame, dear viewer, because this really is one of Hammer's more inventive late efforts. Quirky, darkly humorous, and willing to bend its own rules. And if you fancy a bit more of the red stuff, there's a deeper dive waiting for you in my Hammer Films 1975 to 76 episode on the channel, where I look further in depth at Captain Kronos. I consider Kronos a must-see bit of daring do, pure comic strip brought to life in the medium of film. So I'm giving this 4.5 toad traps out of 5. All for a series of Kronos adventures. We were robbed there.
His name is Grost.
Crookback will do for me.
But not me.
Why?
Because I don't like it.
Oh. He doesn't like it.
To make sport of a physical affliction is both impolite and cruel. After all, I wouldn't dream of calling you Ratface, Fatty, or Big Mouth.
Here on BBC2, we now bring you our horror double bill for this evening. Our first offering is The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, starring Paul Christian. When atomic testing in the Arctic thaws a prehistoric creature from its frozen slumber, the consequences prove rather difficult to contain, as the beast makes its way towards New York, leaving panic in its wake. Then, after the news and weather on 2, we present the first showing on British television, and in colour, The Night of the Lepus. An experimental serum intended to control a rabbit population produces quite the opposite effect, creating a rapidly multiplying horde of oversized and unexpectedly aggressive creatures and a situation that soon hops well beyond control. We hope you enjoy tonight's selection of chills, thrills, and creature features here on BBC2. And so, to our first film, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms.
In the frozen Arctic, a nuclear test awakens something ancient and unstoppable. A colossal prehistoric creature, the Redosaurus, is torn from its million-year slumber and begins a relentless journey south, carving a path of destruction along the North American coast. As panic spreads and the military struggles to contain it, the beast finally reaches New York City, where it unleashes chaos, tearing through streets and landmarks alike. With time running out, one determined scientist and his team must devise a way to stop it. Because this is more than a rampaging beast. It's the fallout of mankind's own making. This is one of my all-time favourite creature features, dear viewer. A film I return to with genuine affection every time it comes around. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms isn't just an entertaining monster movie. It's a genuine landmark. One that helped define an entire decade of atomic age horror and science fiction. Its origins trace back to Ray Bradbury's short story The Foghorn. Originally published under the title The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. It's a melancholy tale about a lonely prehistoric creature drawn to the sound of a lighthouse, mistaking it for the call of its own kind. While discussing a developing film project with his friend Ray Harryhausen, Ray Bradbury noticed a striking similarity between his story and a lighthouse attack sequence in the script. The rights were quickly secured, elements were folded in, and the result is one of those rare moments where inspiration turns into something rather special. This marked Ray Harryhausen's first solo feature as lead animator, after years working under his mentor Willis O'Brien. And on a modest budget of roughly $200,000, he produced something extraordinary. The stop-motion work here is superb, from the eerie nighttime lighthouse attack to the full-scale destruction of the Big Apple. You can even see the early seeds of techniques that would later evolve into his famous dynamation process. The film was directed by Eugene Lurid, an art director turned filmmaker who had previously worked with prestigious film director Jean Renoir, and that background shows. Despite limited resources, Lurid brings a real sense of scale and a moody, almost oppressive atmosphere to the movie. Warner Brothers, recognizing its potential, acquired the finished picture, gave it a strong release, and it went on to gross around $5 million. A major success. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms proved immensely popular at the box office at the time for public and press alike. One particular reporter for the Daily Argus in America enthusiastically fanfared in 1953 of the film when he said,
"A Rhedosaurus by the name of Herman is about to be introduced to movie audiences, and if he doesn't scare the daylights out of them, it isn't the fault of his creators. Actually, there's no such thing as a Rhedosaurus. He's an imaginary brother of the Brontosaurus and other dinosaurs, and might very well have existed 100 million years ago, because no 20th century scientist can prove he didn't. Director Eugene Lurid and technical assistants dreamed him up for the title villain of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and Herman is likely to go down in cinema history as the nastiest monster of them all. He combines the worst characteristics of his prehistoric friend. He's mean, disorderly, and ill-tempered. He crushes big modern autos with a tap of one of his enormous toes. He gobbles up New Yorkers with a flick of his angry tongue, and he's big enough to crush a lighthouse, whose whistle he mistakes for a mating call."
And one that helped open the floodgates for the wave of giant monster films that followed in its wake, including Them that we looked at together, dear viewer, the very next year. In front of the camera, we have solid, reliable work from Paul Christian. Cecil Kellaway brings warmth and authority as Professor Elson, and a young Lee Van Cleef turns up in one of his earliest roles.
I can't hit him from here, mister.
Ever ride one of those things?
Yes, sir.
Jack! Get somebody over here who can operate that roller coaster. We want to get to the top in one of those cars. Right! Put your hood on.
Yes, sir.
Now, while it wasn't the first film to flirt with the idea, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms helped cement something crucial. The image of an ancient creature awakened by mankind's nuclear experiments, that idea would echo across the decade. And in Japan, just a year later, Godzilla would emerge, Gojira, taking that same concept and pushing it into far darker, more sobering territory. Where The Beast offers reassurance, a problem solved by another scientific solution, Godzilla reflects something far more uneasy. And that, for me, is what gives the film its lasting power. Beneath the spectacle, beneath the destruction, there's a very real anxiety at work here. In 1953, the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was still painfully fresh. So when the Redosaurus tears through New York, it isn't just a monster on the loose, it's a manifestation of something humanity has unleashed and may not fully understand. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms remains a landmark. It's exciting, it's very imaginative, and still, I find it thoroughly entertaining today. So for me, this is an easy one. 4.5 radioactive lighthouses out of 5. A bona fide classic, and one that Creature Featuredom owns a debt to, for sure. In the Arizona desert, a desperate attempt to control a booming rabbit population spirals disastrously out of control. When an experimental growth serum is introduced, it has an unintended side effect. The rabbits don't die, they grow. Rapidly multiplying and now monstrously oversized, these once harmless creatures become a ravenous, unstoppable force with a taste for flesh. As night falls, the horde begins its rampage, sweeping across ranches, devouring livestock, and overwhelmingly anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. With the infestation spreading and panic setting in, a small group of scientists and locals scramble to find a way to stop them before the entire region is overrun. Because when the bunnies hop, nobody's safe. Now on paper, dear viewer, this should work. A rapidly multiplying species, an ecological imbalance, science meddling where it probably shouldn't. It's the exact same DNA that gave us giant ants, killer birds, and atomic monsters. Only this time, it's rabbits. Night of the Lepus, dear viewer, is based on the 1964 novel The Year of the Angry Rabbit by Russell Braddon. The book is satirical, darkly comic, fully aware of how absurd the premise is. The film, however, oddly, plays it completely straight. Deadly serious, somewhere between page and screen, dear viewer, the joke did get lost, and that decision shapes everything, because the cast, and this is a proper cast, for example, Janet Leigh post-Psycho, Stuart Whitman, known primarily for westerns and the odd leading man role, and of course, we mustn't forget DeForest Kelley, Bones to you and I. They all perform as if they're in a genuine ecological thriller. Now, to be fair to director William F. Claxton, a veteran of television rather than spectacle cinema, he approaches the material with complete sincerity, treating it like a straight ecological thriller, which only makes the central idea feel even more peculiar. He was facing a bit of a problem, I would imagine. How do you make rabbits frightening? And the answer is, dear viewer, you try everything. Real rabbits filmed in close-up, slow motion, optical compositing, actors reacting to something that isn't there, all the tools are in play. But the result is a kind of tonal disconnect, where the performances are screaming danger and the visuals are, well, rabbits. It's sincerity, colliding head-on with an idea that simply won't cooperate. Context helps, of course, and by the early 1970s cinema was full of nature striking back. The birds had already shown that the natural world could be terrifying, and environmental anxieties were creeping into popular culture. I mean, who could possibly resist a few more bug and bin delights of nature going completely off the rails? Frogs, for instance. All those gloriously questionable offerings from Bert I. Gordon, Food of the Gods, for example, a title that promises divine intervention and delivers oversized beasties with ferocious attitude. And then, well, there's the one Empire of the Ants, starring Joan Collins, a movie she spent the better part of her career pretending never happened. Still, you have to admire it all, dear viewer. That peculiar brand of glam rock grindhouse gigantism, all hair lacquer, hysterics, and genetically buggered fauna, clearly on a reckless diet of growth hormones. Radiation, overpopulation, ecological imbalance, Night of the Lepus taps into all of that. we're living it now. It just happens to express those fears through something soft, small, and fundamentally difficult to take seriously. And yet, there's something oddly admirable about the film. The commitment to the film, I guess, and the refusal to turn it into a joke. So what you're left with here, dear viewer, is a film that doesn't quite work in the way it intends, but works beautifully in another way entirely, as a strange, sincere, almost cult misfire. Night of the Lepus is a film about what happens when every creative decision points in one direction and the central idea pulls in another. And somehow, that's what makes it worth watching. You know what? For a film often derided and has the piss taken out of it, I actually quite enjoyed it and can think of worse films. So, I'm giving Night of the Lepus 3 buck teeth out of 5, just for its sheer gall and its bonkers premise.
Tonight, our horror double bill on 2 begins with Vincent Price in The Bat at just after 10:15. Set in a decidedly gloomy old house, a faceless one-clawed killer is at large when crime writer Cornelia Van Gorder takes up residence in the shadowy mansion of the Oaks. She and her guests soon find themselves drawn into a series of increasingly sinister events and at the mercy of a particularly elusive murderer. Then, after the news and weather at midnight, Legend of the Werewolf. Starring Peter Cushing and Ron Moody, this tale takes us to 19th century Europe, where a travelling showman discovers a strange boy raised by wolves after the brutal death of his parents. The child grows into a seemingly ordinary young man, but when the full moon rises, something far more savage begins to emerge. So, we make our way now to the Oaks for the nefarious crimes of the Bat.
A mysterious masked killer, only known as the Bat, is stalking the inhabitants of an isolated mansion during a ferocious thunderstorm. When a bank robber's stolen fortune is rumoured to be hidden somewhere inside the old house, a group of guests, including the formidable mystery writer Cornelia Van Gorder and the suave Dr. Malcolm Wells, find themselves trapped with a murderer who strikes with metal talons, ripping the throats out of his victims. As bodies begin to pile up and the storm rages outside, the survivors realise the killer could be any one of them, with secret passages, hidden rooms, and a diabolical criminal on the loose. No one here is safe. Who is the Bat? And will anyone survive until the morning? Right then, dear viewer, The Bat, made in 1959. Now this one's a proper old chestnut. It begins with Mary Robert Reinhardt's 1908 novel, The Circular Staircase, which crept its way onto the stage as the smash Broadway play The Bat in 1920. That in turn spawned 2 earlier films, the silent The Bat in 1926, and the early talkie The Bat Whispers in 1930. So, by the time director Crane Wilbur came back to it in 1959, he wasn't adapting something new. He was revisiting an old haunt. What struck me straight away is an early silhouette of the Bat himself. Fedora pulled low, clawed hand raised, and suddenly you're looking at Freddy Krueger, decades early. It's one of those eerie little moments where you feel horror history quietly echoing forward. Now, Crane Wilbur was pushing 70 when he directed this, and you can feel it. The film is deliberately old-fashioned, even for 1959, less full-blooded horror, more creaky old dark house murder mystery. Vincent Price is here, of course, but if I'm honest with you, dear viewer, he's coasting a bit. It's a familiar Vinnie Price routine, delivered with one eye on the clock. The one who really walks away with the picture for me was the magnificent Agnes Moorehead, yes, Samantha's mother from Bewitched. Here she plays mystery writer Cornelia Van Gorder, and she's absolutely in her element. Acerbic, sharp.
My wife, Miss Van Gorder, Miss Allen.
How do you do, Mrs.
How do you do? Cornelia Van Gorder.
Yes.
Oh, well, I've read every murder mystery you've ever written. I just adored that weird one, The Private Morgue of Dr. X, even though it gave me the shivers.
Only the shivers? Scared hell out of me.
Oh.
Well, I really mean that Miss Corney killed them off in that one.
When you refer to my books, please don't call me Miss Corney.
And cleverly having a marvellous time. She's the engine that keeps the whole thing alive, from what I could see. You've also got Darla Hood, one of the original Our Gang children from those films that were made in America throughout the 1920s and 30s onwards. She appears here in her final film role. And there's also Lenita Lane, a veteran of the silent era, who makes for a wonderfully jittery foil as Lizzie. Now, it is slow, very talky, and it does drag in places. Watch this late at night after a long day, and there's a genuine risk you'll nod off before the big reveal. I did twice. But there's a creaky charm to it, of course, with those secret passages, hidden rooms, and even one rigged to suffocate its occupants, which I rather enjoyed. A hidden fortune, a sprawling, rickety mansion, it ticks every box for that cosy, lightly morbid, old dark house atmosphere. And interestingly, you can glimpse something else here too, the early blueprint of the faceless gloved killer. It's not quite giallo yet, but you can feel it forming. Blood and black lace isn't a million miles away. For years, the Bat suffered the usual public domain fate, murky, dreadful transfers, but seen properly in a decent high-definition print, there's a suppressed luster there, detailed texture, finally allowed to breathe. So all in all, the Bat is a perfectly pleasant old-school way to spend an evening, especially if you're in the mood for something cosy and just a little bit creaky. It's harmless hokum, elevated by a couple of genuine legends. So for this double bill treat, I'm giving it 3 rabid bat flaps out of 5. Solid enough, but it could have done with a bit more squeak.
Did you know there's a door in this paneling?
No, I didn't.
Oh, my gracious, so there is.
Maybe it opens to a secret passage.
Oh,
certainly to a secret
oh,
something.
secret
Who knows, girls? We'll be about to stumble on that missing million.
Oh, this is...
There's a panel. There must be some gimmick to it.
There always is.
Yes, it moves. It moves. It moves.
Oh.
A feral child, known only as a Étoile, is discovered living like an animal and brought back to civilization by a travelling circus. Raised among performers but never truly civilized, Étoile grows into a quiet, troubled young man. Something in him never quite settles. When the full moon rises, he changes, and what emerges is anything but human. As a series of brutal murders begin to terrorize the city, the authorities are left grasping for answers. But one man is determined to uncover the truth, Professor Paul Cataflung, a brilliant and obsessive pathologist who becomes convinced that something unnatural is stalking the streets of Paris. As the killings continue, the pattern becomes harder to ignore, and the truth edges closer to the surface. Caught between instinct and humanity, Étoile finds himself fighting a losing battle as the beast within him begins to take hold. Legend of the Werewolf, or as I like to say, Legend of the Werewolf, is another release from Tyburn Films that languished in the same limbo as its companion piece, The Ghoul. Rumour has it, currently, that Hammer Films may now hold the rights, with whispers of a release circling once again. But we've heard that tune before, dear viewer, haven't we? And it's never quite reached the final note. Directed by Freddie Francis, Legend is frankly a mixed bag. It's rich in a fetid atmosphere and steeped in tragedy, but noticeably light on outright shocks. The film scores a goal, then promptly concedes one, and so it goes back and forth across its 90-minute duration. There are clear parallels with The Curse of the Werewolf, as we've discussed. Curse is a lurid, melodramatic little beast of a film, all fur, fangs and repression, yet surprisingly it wasn't a commercial success at the time. Hammer never followed it up because of that, making Legend feel like the next best thing to a remake. With a screenplay by Anthony Hines, we're essentially given a slightly different stew from the same pot of ideas, but due to either time restraints or budget, the narrative feels cramped. Characters are sketched rather than explored, and the film rarely allows its ideas to breathe. Most of the cast fall into two-dimensional territory, leaning heavily on trope and caricature. Ron Moody, for instance, feels like he's still circling aspects of Fagin, bringing little that feels new. The exception, of course, is Peter Cushing, who elevates the material with sheer presence alone. What does compensate, though, is the atmosphere, and Legend leans into it heavily. The dingy set pieces, the oppressive mood, and especially that final chase through the Parisian sewers, all of that does work. The film itself is a curious hybrid. It draws from two separate stories, Plague of the Werewolves by Kevin Francis and Wolf Boy by Hines, the latter written under his nom de plume, John Elder. These were fused into the screenplay we see here, though it's clear Hines' influence dominates. Looming over it all, of course, is The Werewolf of Paris by Guy Endore from a literary perspective, and perhaps even a touch of The Wild Child, cinematically directed by Francois Truffaut, made 5 years before in its feral child sensibilities. Now, one element that genuinely unsettled me is the animal cruelty threaded through the narrative. Thankfully, little is shown explicitly, but the suggestion of wolves being clubbed to death, it lands hard, especially when you consider how close they are visually and emotionally to dogs. And those urchins tormenting the caged animals, it's unpleasant stuff. Frankly, I'd have welcomed a bit of justice there. Let it twirl loose on the little shits. Properly. Throat-rippingly properly. There were reports at the time that one of the wolves escaped, raising questions about animal welfare, but Kevin Francis denied any wrongdoing, stating that the RSPCA were present on set. Still, the animal was later shot by police, despite harming no one or creature. Unlike Curse, which centres firmly on Lyon, Legend sidelines its own werewolf, Etoile. David Rintoul is perfectly competent, but the role gives him little room to leave an impression. He appears in brief, often maudlin bursts, never fully realised. Much of the same applies to the rest of the cast, most of whom barely register beyond bit parts. That said, it's a genuine surprise to see Roy Castle turn up as the epicene photographer in his third and final brush with horror and science fiction on the big screen, gamely deploying his trademark guffaw and affable bumbling routine. Fortunately, he's not on screen long enough for him to be truly shit-itchingly annoying. Cushing's Inspector Cataflanque dominates the film, though even here the character lacks proper depth. His motivation, particularly his willingness to risk everything for Etoile, never quite feels earned. It's a recurring issue. Ideas are present, but underdeveloped, sadly. Interestingly, early cuts of the film reportedly featured more of Cushing, but these scenes were trimmed in favour of additional werewolf footage, presumably to remind audiences what sort of film they were watching. Francis's direction is functional, competent, but rarely inspired. The red, filtered point-of-view shots are effective at first, but quickly overused. What begins as a stylistic flourish becomes repetitive, even diluting the impact of the violence. That dead horse was flogged admirably. The opening sequence depicting immigrants attacked by wolves feels particularly awkward. It's clearly there to justify Etoile's origin, but it's clumsily inserted. Even Cushing's warm fireside narration can't quite smooth over how abrupt it feels. Thematically, the film revisits familiar territory. As with Curse, there's that thread of transformation tied to sexual frustration, but here it's reworked into jealousy, creating a chain reaction where victims are often linked by desire and betrayal. It's an interesting angle, but again, underexplored. Visually, the film has its moments. The werewolf design is decent enough on screen, though ironically far less feral than the creature depicted in the poster art. Transformation sequences are smoother than earlier efforts, which is something, but the overall cinematography feels flat, especially when compared to Francis's earlier work like The Skull. Still, by 1975, horror had moved on. Audiences were beginning to crave something more visceral, more transgressive, compared to what would soon arrive with The Howling.
Gun won't do you any good, mister.
Don't come any closer.
This feels like the end of an era rather than the start of something new. Legend received a tepid response on release and didn't even make it to cinemas in the United States. In the UK, it was paired with Vampire Circus, a far more ebullient companion piece. And that really is a tragedy of it, dear viewer. Legend of the Werewolf could have been something stronger. You can see the intention, the ambition, but it never quite coalesces. So taking everything into account, I'm giving Legend of the Werewolf 2.5 throat rips out of 5. And I'm more confident in that score than stretching it to a 3. With a better print, perhaps that might shift slightly, but as it stands, it's a fitting if somewhat lacklustre addition to this season's horror lineup. A film that lingers more fondly in the memory than it quite earns on the big, or in this case little, screen.
I'll throw my gun away. I know I can trust you, but well.
Help me. Please.
You're watching BBC2, and this is the final night of our Horror Double Bill season. At 10:40 we present The Tower of London. Starring Boris Karloff and Basil Rathbone, this lavish historical drama charts the ruthless rise of Richard III, a man for whom ambition knows no bounds, and for whom even family proves no obstacle. Then, rounding off the double bill just after midnight, an amicus production, The Skull. Starring Peter Cushing, this chilling tale concerns the skull of the Marquis de Sade, an object said to possess a most malign influence over those who come into contact with it. So, for one final evening, we invite you to settle in for our double bill of terror, as we now journey back to one of history's most infamous courts, the Tower of London.
In 15th century England, the ruthless and deformed Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was stopped at nothing to seize the throne. With the aid of his loyal yet sadistic henchman Maud, Richard embarks on a merciless campaign of murder, betrayal and torture, eliminating all who stand between him and the crown, including his own brother, King Edward IV, and his young nephews, the princes in the Tower. Driven by a cold and calculated ambition, Richard edges even closer to becoming King Richard III, no matter how many innocent lives must be crushed beneath his ascent. Now, dear viewer, have you heard about Richard III? What a turd was Richard III? Or was he? Because if Tower of London is anything to go by, he most certainly was. This is an amazing film, and I loved it. Dear viewer, each of this season has a pearl in the grit, and for me, this was it for this one. You see, Tower of London isn't just another historical drama dressed in chainmail and court intrigue, it's something far murkier. A film that takes history, drags it into the dungeon, and lets it fester. And at the centre of it all, Basil Rathbone as Richard III. Cold, calculated, psychotic, and utterly superb, Rathbone practically licks the poison from the script. Rathbone barely raises his voice, barely shifts his expression, and yet you can feel the contempt radiating off him. Everyone around him is either a pawn or already dead men walking, and simply hasn't realised this yet. Now, of course, we have to address the obvious. This isn't history. Or rather, its history is filtered through William Shakespeare, and then sharpened further by Universal into something approaching Gothic horror. The real Richard remains a figure of debate, his reputation shaped heavily by Tudor propaganda. But here, there's no ambiguity. Here he is ambition incarnate, and the film revels in it. But Rathbone isn't alone in this little chamber of horrors. You've got Boris Karloff, and his villainy here is something quite different, less regal, more primal. His Maud is all lurking menace and quiet brutality. There's a physicality to him, a sense that if Richard is the mind, Maud is the hand that carries out the unspeakable. And then there's that marvellous touch for me, which I loved, the dollhouse. A macabre little catalogue of victims, each little dolly representing the dead and soon to be dead.
I've plans for you all, my little ones. Taper Crown Henry. Wales. You robbed me of the only woman I will ever love. My nephews. Brother Clarence. Myself. I will not always be sixth in succession to the throne.
It's practically a proto-serial killer trope, using objects to keep track of murder, who's gone and who's next. Genuinely inspired and faintly chilling in a way the film almost underplays. The supporting cast, frankly, are performing to the hilt. Vincent Price appears as Clarence, a petulant, grasping younger brother, already hinting at the delicious theatricality he'd later perfect. And there's a lovely bit of trivia here. The wine he gets gloriously drunk on, and consequently drowns in, was Coca-Cola. Not quite the blood of the vine, but it does the job neatly. Ian Hunter, the actor there, gives us a boisterous, confident king, while actress Barbara O'Neill's Queen Elizabeth carries that simmering dread, and quite rightly so. Miles Mander's Henry VI is beautifully feeble, and the young lovers, played by actor John Sutton and actress Nan Gray, thread through the narrative, as they so often must in these productions, something for the audience to cling to while the crown is soaked in blood. Now let's talk about the atmosphere, because this is where the film really earns its place in this season. Directed by Roland V. Lee, there's a palpable sense of machination and danger running through the entire mise-en-scène. You can feel the conspiracy tightening like a noose. And then, those torture sequences. For a film operating under the Hays Code, they're surprisingly eyebrow-raising. Veiled, yes, in history, but unmistakable. There's a masochistic cruelty here that later films like Witchfinder General and Mark of the Devil would drag fully into the light with far more graphic intent. Here it's suggestion, implication, but somehow that makes it more insidious for me. Production itself was not without its battles. Filming wrapped on the 4th of September 1939, running 10 days over schedule and nearly $80,000 over budget. The battle scenes, particularly Tewkesbury and Bosworth, were an ordeal. Shot in punishing 100-degree heat, with fog machines rendered useless by wind and rain machines turning cardboard props into pulp, it's a minor miracle any of it holds together. And yet on screen, it is bloody marvellous. The final battle sequence is genuinely spectacular. You've got the horses, the mud, the steel, the chaos, and a little bit of violence in there as well. It has weight, scale, and a real sense of culmination. You feel the end closing in. For this film, Rathbone himself was juggling multiple projects at the time, even working on the film Rio during the first week of production, and missing out on the far more prestigious The Hunchback of Notre Dame as a result. And as for the score, studio heads panicked after a preview screening, realising it consisted almost entirely of period music. A new score was ordered, but time ran out, leaving Frank Skinner to piece together something workable from Son of Frankenstein. A patchwork solution and a film at the other end of the spectrum, but a highly effective one. Now, it's worth mentioning that the story would be revisited. In 1962, Roger Corman directed another Tower of London with none other than Vincent Price stepping into the role of Richard III. A neat bit of symmetry, the younger brother becoming the tyrant.
Well, I find this quite appropriate. Yeah.
Richard! Richard! Richard, I beg of you! Richard!
While you are being entertained by your hungry guest, I shall be crowned.
So where does that leave us, dear viewer? Well, despite one or two structural limitations, and yes, perhaps it falls just shy of being the great historical epic it clearly aspires to be, I can't help but admire this. The ambition, the performances, the sheer gothic weight of it all. This isn't just a film, it's a pageant of ambition, betrayal and inevitability, and for me, it is the highlight of this season's double bill. So with that in mind, Tower of London earns a full 5 bloodied thrones out of 5. I was captivated by this film from the beginning, and it never lets up. What a superb gem to be included in the final 2 horror double bill offerings for this 1980 season.
What news of Wyatt?
He sailed on the French ship, the one that dropped down the river last night. I should have killed him on the rack.
The Queen and Tudor have been hand in glove, with Wyatt as go-between. That woman has stopped me at every turn. She's in sanctuary, but I can't touch her.
But I can crush her spirit for all time. Take the young princes to the Bloody Tower.
Christopher Maitland is a respected collector of the occult, a man drawn to objects best left alone. His latest obsession, the skull of the infamous Marquis de Sade. Believing it holds dark secrets, Maitland acquires it only to discover he's taken possession of something far more deadly. Strange occurrences begin to plague his life, and those around him suffer increasingly terrifying fates. Despite warnings, Maitland cannot let it go. What begins as curiosity soon turns to fixation, and then to fear. Haunted by nightmares and creeping paranoia, he finds himself locked in a battle for his very own soul against an evil that doesn't just haunt, but consumes. In the case of the skull, if you want a more in-depth appreciation of the film, do check out my Amicus Odyssey Part 2 here on this channel. There's plenty more facts and trivias concerning this film waiting for you there. But a brief rundown for the movie. Well, it was fresh off the success of Dr. Terror's House of Horrors that Paramount were more than happy to keep the coffers open for Amicus, and so this curious little chiller came to life, bringing together maestros Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee once again, under the direction of Freddie Francis. The story itself comes from Robert Bloch's tale, The Skull of the Marquis de Sade, and that name alone was enough to make the censors start sharpening their scissors, dear viewer, because with de Sade, as we know, comes notoriety. Sexual sadism, cruelty, and other nefarious perversions form the mind of a possible madman. The British Board of Censors were clutching their pearls and made it abundantly clear They were not keen to see such twisted titillation paraded across the screen. Head censor John Trevelyan suggested the story might be better told without Desard at all, which rather defeats the point. As a result, a number of sequences were toned down or altered, the more sadistic elements softened, a dream torture sequence reworked, and even the rather nasty idea of the skull ripping a man's throat out came under scrutiny and were ultimately abandoned. Behind the scenes, things were just as unusual. The original script ran to barely 50 minutes, so the rest had to be made up on the spot, quite literally written as Freddie Francis et al. Went along to stretch it out to feature length, and if we're being honest, you can feel it in places. What you do get, though, is style, and plenty of it. For instance, Francis leans heavily into the atmosphere, crafting Maitland's study as a gothic playground of red velvet, black wax and occult bric-a-brac, all bathed in deep, oppressive tones. The use of point-of-view shots from the skull itself, achieved with a large-scale prop, adds a real sense of the jitters. And one of my favourite touches, the looking glass, at first perfectly ordinary, then slowly distorting, warping, until it finally shatters completely, as neat visual echo of Maitland's own mind giving way, is superb. Performance-wise, this is very much Peter Cushing's show. His descent into obsession showcases his talents admirably, even when the script is clearly being stitched together around him. The skull may lean more towards style than substance, but it's a striking little piece all the same, and proof that with the right eye behind the camera, you can salvage something from even the most scruffy Spartan beginnings. Upon reviewing the skull once again, the score remains at 3 cat-o'-nine-tails out of 5. Now, where's my whip?
Not a double bill, but concluding our season of horror movies, at midnight tonight we present The Beast Must Die, starring Calvin Lockhart as a wealthy big-game hunter who invites a distinctly unusual group of guests to his remote country house, among them Peter Cushing as a noted expert in lycanthropy. His intention is simple, to identify and destroy the werewolf he believes is hiding in their midst. But as the night unfolds, suspicions deepen and the guest list begins to shrink rather alarmingly. But first on BBC2, the cricket highlights from Lord's.
And so, dear viewer, The Beast Must Die ended the Horror Double Bill season for 1980 as a standalone feature. Now, if you want the full howl at this movie, then check out the last episode of my Amicus Odyssey. Including in the review is also a little look again at the funky genre known as black exploitation. So, I hope you enjoy that one.
Oh, what a splendid little season that was.
I left a few reviews aside since some were covered fairly recently, but I simply couldn't resist revisiting a few Amicus and Hammer delights for our fiefdom. And where titles from the double bills have already appeared on this channel, do pop over and get the full kit and caboodle there.
And on a slightly sad note, next time brings us to our final horror double bill from 1981.
Alas, yes, but what a triumph this entire journey has been, and a huge thank you to all you lovely viewers who've travelled through the cobwebbed vaults with me so far.
Does this mean I'll have to sign on at the Labour Exchange?
Oh, I'm sure I'll find you something. You've become quite difficult to get rid of.
That's oddly touching, I think.
Let's live for today and leave tomorrow to its own devices, until, of course, we arrive there.
Until next time on Look, Look and Look Again. Oh dear me, I'm feeling rather emotional now, Crab.
Oh, pull yourself together, continuity. We've another stack of outre delights waiting in 1981.
In that case, until next time on Look, Look and Look Again.
Much love to our fiefdom. Cheerio.